The streets are still standing, the flags are still flying, but something essential is missing. What happens to a country when its factories run its metros, move its cities, glow at night, yet the people who once held it together are gone? This is the silent question hanging over Russia today, heavier than any missile strike or battlefield map. The war has consumed more than territory and treasure. It has consumed time, youth, and demographic momentum, and the bill is now coming due. Entire sectors began to rely on imported labor. Transportation, housing, manufacturing, sanitation jobs once filled by Russian men now depended on workers arriving from abroad. India became a key source. Central Asia followed. Later, other Asian states were drawn into the system. The rationale was simple. These workers were available, affordable, and willing to accept conditions that native labor increasingly rejected. In a wartime economy, speed mattered more than cohesion. Moscow became the most visible symbol of this transformation. Employment centers filled with foreign applicants. Dormitories and temporary housing expanded. New languages entered everyday public space. The change was not subtle. On the metro, in industrial zones, and around infrastructure projects, the faces of the workforce shifted rapidly. What had once been an emergency measure hardened into routine practice. The wage structure deepened resentment. Many imported workers were offered salaries higher than what local Russians earned in equivalent positions. From the state's perspective, this was market logic competition for scarce labor. From the street's perspective, it looked like displacement. Russian families, already strained by inflation and war losses, now saw outsiders filling jobs while earning more protected by state-backed contracts. This is where economics collided with identity. For years, official messaging emphasized cultural preservation and resistance to foreign influence. Now, the same system was underwriting mass labor importation. The contradiction was impossible to miss. Patriotism demanded sacrifice, but sacrifice no longer guaranteed economic security. For many Russians, the message felt inverted. The war removed their sons, while the economy rewarded their replacements. The government framed the influx as temporary. Officials spoke of stabilization, reconstruction, and eventual normalization, but projections told another story. Labor shortfalls were not shrinking, they were expanding. Each mobilization wave widened the gap. Each casualty reduced the domestic workforce further. Imported labor was no longer a stopgap, it was becoming structural. This dependency carried strategic risk. A workforce with limited roots in society has little stake in long-term stability. Integration requires time, trust, and investment luxuries a wartime state rarely prioritizes. Without them, parallel communities emerge. Economic necessity binds them to the system, but social cohesion does not. What began as a logistical fix thus reshaped the internal balance of the country. The war reached into neighborhoods not through explosions, but through absence filled by people with no connection to the conflict that created the vacuum they now occupy. And as this new reality settled in, it became clear that the front line was no longer only in Ukraine. It now ran through Russia's own cities, workplaces, and daily life. The question shifted accordingly. If a nation must import its workforce to sustain a war, what does that reveal about the sustainability of the war itself? And how long can such a model function before economic necessity turns into social fracture? The tension did not announce itself with speeches or declarations. It surfaced in arguments at bus stops, in confrontations on construction sites, in videos circulating briefly online before disappearing. For years, nationalist rhetoric had painted unity as unquestionable and loyalty as automatic. But when ideology met everyday competition for jobs, housing, and dignity, that unity began to fracture. Public discourse had long celebrated alliances beyond the West. Slogans about shared struggle and multipolar solidarity filled screens and comment sections. Yet the arrival of foreign labor turned abstract partnerships into physical presence. The difference mattered. Online enthusiasm evaporated when reality moved next door. What had been framed as geopolitical brotherhood now felt to many Russians like intrusion. After years of high-intensity fighting, Russia faces a labor and population shock unseen in modern European history. Hundreds of thousands of men have been killed, wounded, or permanently removed from civilian life. Others have fled abroad to avoid mobilization. The immediate effect is visible everywhere. Empty workbenches stalled, construction projects, understaffed transport systems, and a service economy stretched to the breaking point. The deeper effect is less visible, but far more dangerous, a collapse of the social contract that once linked sacrifice to stability. Incidents multiplied, verbal disputes escalated into fights, accusations of favoritism spread, migrant workers became convenient targets for anger that had no safe outlet, criticizing the war carried risk, questioning mobilization was dangerous. Economic frustration, however, could be redirected, and it was. The result was a street-level backlash that the state struggled to control without acknowledging its own role in creating the conditions. Law enforcement faced an impossible balance. Crack down too hard, and the labor pipeline might break. Look away, and resentment would deepen. The response was selective enforcement, highly visible raids, followed by quiet releases, symbolic shows of order that changed little beneath the surface. This approach managed appearances, not causes. The deeper problem was psychological. War demands sacrifice, but it also demands meaning. As losses mounted, that meaning became harder to sustain. When citizens saw foreign workers filling roles once held by those killed or mobilized, the narrative of shared burden collapsed. Sacrifice began to feel one-sided. Loyalty felt unrewarded. Nationalist communities reacted with confusion, then hostility. The same voices that once praised global alliances now warned of cultural erosion. The shift was abrupt, almost desperate. Ideology adjusted to emotion, not the other way around. The state's silence amplified the effect. Without clear guidance, resentment filled the gap. This friction was not merely social, it was strategic. Internal instability weakens wartime resilience. Trust erodes. Productivity suffers. A society distracted by internal conflict cannot easily sustain external confrontation. History offers countless examples of empires undone not by enemies at the gate, but by fractures within. What made the situation more volatile was its permanence. These changes were not temporary deployments or short-term programs. They were embedded responses to long-term decline. Every attempt to reverse them risked economic shock. Every attempt to ignore them risked unrest. The result was a country pulled in opposing directions. The state needed foreign labor to function. The population resented the visible cost of that dependence. Between them lay a growing gap of mistrust, one that propaganda could narrow only so far. As tensions simmered, attention shifted eastward. Because labor dependency was only one side of the equation, economic survival required something else as well: capital markets and political cover. And for that, Russia increasingly looked to a partner whose influence was expanding quietly, steadily, and with far-reaching consequences. Economic gravity does not announce itself with conquest. It arrives through contracts, dependencies, and silence. As Western sanctions tightened and traditional markets closed, Russia's strategic options narrowed. Survival required capital, trade, and access to supply chains beyond its own borders. In that narrowing space, one partner grew indispensable, and with indispensability came leverage. China's role expanded first through energy, then finance, then people. Discounted oil and gas flowed east. Payments shifted away from traditional systems. Regional agreements multiplied. None of this looked dramatic on its own. Together, it reshaped the balance of power inside Russia's own territory. The war accelerated a process already underway: economic asymmetry turning into structural dependence. Official rhetoric still frames endurance as patriotism. State television celebrates resilience. But numbers tell a different story. Birth rates have fallen to levels not recorded even during the darkest chapters of the 20th century. This is not a temporary dip caused by uncertainty. It is a structural decline accelerated by war fear and economic pressure. A shrinking working age population means fewer taxpayers, fewer soldiers, and fewer families able or willing to imagine a future inside the system as it exists today. Visa policies symbolize the shift. Relaxed entry rules opened the door to a surge of Chinese tourism and labor. What followed was not merely an increase in visitors, but a visible change in urban rhythms, especially in eastern cities and historic centers. Commercial districts adapted. Local businesses adjusted their language pricing and orientation. The market spoke, and it spoke Mandarin. In the Far East, the transformation carried deeper implications. Regions long sensitive about demographic balance began to tilt. Chinese workers, traders, and investors became a constant presence. Infrastructure projects tied local economies more tightly to cross-border supply chains. For Moscow, this was a lifeline. For regional populations, it felt like a quiet transfer of influence. One contract, one lease, one workforce at a time. This was not occupation. It did not require flags or troops. It required only need. A state under pressure makes concessions. A partner with options sets terms. Beijing did not have to demand control. Conditions produced it organically. Over time, dependence hardened into expectation. Russian planners adjusted accordingly, prioritizing stability over autonomy. The strategic irony was unavoidable. A war framed as resistance to external dominance resulted in deeper reliance on a single external power. Sovereignty became conditional. Policy choices increasingly reflected not domestic preference, but the boundaries of what would preserve economic flow. This dependency carried long-term risk. Influence rooted in economics is resilient. It survives leadership changes, rhetoric shifts, even partial disengagement. Once supply chains, labor markets, and regional economies realign, reversing them is costly and destabilizing. Moscow understood this, but wartime logic left little room for alternatives. The question was no longer whether China's presence would expand, but how far. In resource-rich regions, influence followed extraction. In cities, it followed commerce. In policy, it followed necessity. Each step was rational in isolation. Together, they marked a strategic reorientation with consequences extending far beyond the current conflict. As this quiet expansion continued, another layer of dependence emerged, one less visible, more disturbing, and harder to reconcile with claims of national revival. It involved not markets or tourists, but human labor stripped of choice, and it pointed to how far the system was willing to go to sustain itself. When labor shortages reached a critical threshold, the line between economics and coercion blurred. What began as recruitment evolved into compulsion. The system no longer asked only who was willing to come, but who could be made to work. In that space, a new workforce emerged, one defined not by contracts, but by control. North Korean labor became the most extreme expression of this logic. Bound by state agreements rather than individual choice, these workers arrived under conditions that mirrored another century. Long shifts, minimal pay, restricted movement, constant surveillance. They did not integrate into society because they were never meant to. They existed as a resource managed, rotated, and replaced as needed. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It filled gaps in construction and industry. It generated revenue streams for allied regimes. It reduced political risk at home by keeping the most exploitative practices out of public view. But it also revealed something deeper: the erosion of institutional norms that once separated civilian labor from wartime necessity. The Kremlin's response has been pragmatic rather than ideological. The priority is not identity, but continuity. Factories must run, cities must function. The war effort requires industrial output, logistics, and constant replenishment. And so the state has turned outward, opening channels that would have been politically unthinkable a decade ago. Labor shortages are no longer framed as a problem to be solved internally, but as a gap to be filled quickly by anyone willing to come. Reports pointed to assignments in sensitive sectors, including manufacturing linked to defense production. This crossed the threshold. It meant that the war economy was no longer supported merely by domestic sacrifice or foreign contracts, but by systems of labor that stripped individuals of agency entirely. The moral cost was enormous, the strategic signal even more so. The precedent did not stop there. Migrants from other regions faced pressure that blurred into forced mobilization. Promises of legal status, wages, or protection were tied to service. Documents were signed under duress. Identities shifted overnight from worker to soldier. For many, the transition was irreversible. This model solved immediate manpower shortages, but at a staggering price. Trust collapsed. Fear spread through migrant communities. Productivity suffered as coercion replaced incentive. And within the armed forces, divisions deepened. Those sent forward without training or support were treated as expendable, reinforcing a hierarchy that corroded cohesion. History shows that armies built on compulsion fracture under stress. Loyalty cannot be forced indefinitely, and societies that normalize exploitation lose the moral authority they rely on to demand sacrifice from their own citizens. The contradiction was stark. A state claiming to defend tradition and sovereignty relied on practices that echoed the darkest chapters of industrial warfare. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened until it could no longer be ignored. At this stage, the war's impact was no longer measured only in casualties or territory. It was measured in what the state was willing to become to continue, and that raised a final unavoidable question, one not about tactics or alliances, but about survival itself. If a country sustains its power by hollowing out its population, outsourcing its workforce, and coercing those with the least protection, what remains when the war finally ends? And will the structures built to endure crisis be capable of sustaining peace? By this point, the pattern is impossible to dismiss as coincidence or temporary strain. Demographics, labor, economics, and coercion converge into a single trajectory. A state at war has begun consuming its own future to sustain its present. The consequences are not speculative. They are already unfolding. Russia's demographic decline is not merely a statistic, it is a strategic constraint. Fewer births today mean fewer workers, fewer soldiers, and fewer taxpayers tomorrow. Unlike economic cycles, this cannot be reversed quickly. Even if the war ended immediately, the lost years would remain lost. A generation removed from civilian life does not reappear on command. This reality reshapes power. Territorial control depends not only on borders and armies, but on people willing and able to live, work, and identify with the state. As population density thins and dependence on external labor grows, cohesion weakens, influence fills the gaps. In the Far East, economic gravity pulls eastward. In major cities, parallel societies emerge. Authority becomes uneven. This marks a turning point. For years, Russian power rested on the assumption of demographic depth, a large population capable of absorbing losses and sustaining long conflicts. That assumption is now broken. What replaces it is improvisation, short-term fixes layered over long-term decline. Imported labor becomes not a supplement, but a substitute for a generation that is no longer there. Strategically, this undermines federation itself. A centralized system relies on demographic balance to project control across vast space. When that balance shifts, governance becomes transactional rather than organic. Regions adapt to whoever provides stability, jobs, and continuity. Loyalty follows function. The irony is sharp. A war launched to secure prestige has accelerated decline. A campaign framed as defense has produced vulnerability. The tools used to endure imported labor, external dependence, coercion solve immediate problems while magnifying long-term ones. Each fix narrows future options. Globally, the parallels are instructive. States under pressure often trade freedom for security. They prioritize survival over reform. History shows where that path leads brittle systems that hold until they suddenly do not. Power concentrated under stress fractures when stress becomes permanent. The human cost remains the quiet constant beneath every calculation. Families emptied, communities altered, workers reduced to instruments, soldiers treated as consumables. The language of necessity justifies it all until necessity becomes habit. And so the question that now hangs over Russia is not simply whether it can win a war, but whether it can remain whole in the process. Can a country sustain sovereignty while outsourcing labor influence and even coercion? Can identity survive when survival itself depends on external scaffolding? This is not only Russia's dilemma, it is a warning visible across modern conflicts from prolonged wars to great power rivalries. What is sacrificed first, freedom, people, or future when states refuse to recalibrate? Because once a nation starts trading tomorrow for today, the final cost is never paid all at once. It arrives slowly, quietly, and then all at once. This documentary traced how prolonged war has pushed Russia into a demographic, economic, and strategic crisis that extends far beyond the battlefield. Massive losses and emigration hollowed out the workforce, forcing the state to import labor at scale. What began as an emergency measure became structural dependence, reshaping cities, economies, and social cohesion. As foreign labor filled domestic gaps, resentment grew, nationalist narratives collided with lived reality, social friction escalated while authorities managed appearances rather than causes. At the same time, economic isolation deepened reliance on China, quietly shifting influence in key regions and tying Russia's future to external power. The most alarming development emerged where necessity turned into coercion. Exploitative labor practices and forced mobilization revealed institutional decay, eroding moral authority and long-term stability. Together, these trends point to a system sustaining itself by consuming its own foundations. The contradiction is stark. A war launched in the name of national strength has exposed national fragility. A campaign justified by sovereignty has produced dependence. Each casualty on the front line echoes back home, not only as a personal tragedy, but as an economic and demographic subtraction. Multiply that loss across months and years, and the result is a country forced to outsource its own survival. The story is not just about Russia. It reflects a broader warning about modern warfare and state power. When survival is prioritized at any cost, the future becomes the first casualty. The final question remains open. Can a state preserve sovereignty, cohesion, and legitimacy when endurance depends on hollowing itself out from within? This is the context in which today's transformation must be understood. Not as cultural change, not as globalization by choice, but as emergency response. Russia is not opening its doors because it wants to redefine itself. It is doing so because the alternative is paralysis, and in wartime, paralysis is defeat by another name. As the war drags on and the population curve continues downward, a fundamental question emerges, one that no amount of propaganda can fully suppress. Can a state sustain great power ambitions when its human foundation is steadily eroding from within? Or is this the moment when the costs of war finally overtake the narrative that justified it in the first place? The solution arrived not with fanfare, but with flights, quotas, and contracts. As Russia's labor deficit widened, the state moved quickly to replace what the war had removed. Work permits were expanded, recruitment channels were formalized, agreements were signed quietly, then implemented at scale. What followed was a demographic shift visible not in policy papers, but on the streets and factories and across construction sites stretching from Moscow to the Urals.